She lies upside down in 110 feet of water. Her propellers point toward the surface. Her pagoda superstructure is buried in the sand below her, and the guns that once covered the most devastating naval raid in American history now point downward at nothing. Technical divers move around her in the blue silence. She is immense. She is still. This ship was the flagship of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto during the attack on Pearl Harbor. From her bridge, Yamamoto received the signal, "Tora, Tora, Tora," that the strike was underway. She was the last surviving Japanese battleship, and in the summer of 1946, the United States Navy brought her to a remote Pacific lagoon, along with what remained of the defeated Japanese and captured German fleet, and dropped an atomic bomb on her. She didn't sink. She survived the first bomb. She survived the initial blast of the second. For 5 days after the last explosion, she sat in a contaminated lagoon, listing slowly, too radioactive for any sailor to approach, too stubborn to die. American sailors had already strapped mines to her hull to force her under. She refused. She went on her own terms, alone in the dark, before dawn on July 30th, 1946. When the Americans came out to look at the lagoon that morning, the spot where she had been was simply empty. This is the story of what America thought it was doing at Bikini Atoll, and what it actually did. It is late 1945. The war is over, the Navy has won, and the Navy is terrified. The atomic bomb that ended the war had also asked a question the Navy could not afford to leave unanswered. If a single weapon, small enough to fit in the belly of a B-29, could vaporize a city, what did that mean for aircraft carriers, for battleships, for the entire doctrine of surface naval power? The Army Air Forces had an answer they were happy to provide. Navies were obsolete. The future belonged to strategic air power. Why maintain a fleet that could be annihilated in a single pass? These were not theoretical arguments. They were budget arguments being made loudly in Washington in the months after Japan surrendered, with careers and institutional survival at stake. On August 25, 1945, Senator Brian McMahon of Connecticut openly advocated for testing the atomic bomb on captured Japanese ships. On October 16th, Chief of Naval Operations Ernest J. King formally recommended the idea to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The logic was simple. If you want to prove that navies can survive nuclear war, you have to actually test it. On January 10th, 1946, President Truman created Joint Task Force 1. Vice Admiral William Henry Purnell, Blandy, known throughout the Navy as Spike, took command the next day. Blandy was a trim, methodical man, a career ordnance specialist. He had spent the end of the war as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Special Weapons, which made him, in the Navy's view, exactly the right person to oversee the most complex and public military test ever attempted. The press called him Buck Rogers of the Navy. He accepted the nickname with equanimity. He understood the theater of it. He named the operation himself. "I named the project Operation Crossroads," he said later, because it was apparent that warfare, perhaps civilization itself, had been brought to a turning point in history by this revolutionary weapon. He was right about that. What he could not yet know was which way the crossroads would lead. Before a single ship entered the lagoon, 167 people left it. Bikini Atoll, a cluster of 23 low-lying islands surrounding a deep, sheltered lagoon in the Marshall Islands, had been chosen for its remoteness, its depth, and its distance from established shipping routes. It was also, and this was easier to overlook, home. In February 1946, the Bikinian people were told they would have to go. American officials came ashore and explained that a great experiment was to take place, one that might protect the world from the very weapon that had just ended the war. The Bikinians were told that their cooperation would aid world peace. They were told they were to be like the children of Israel, guided by the United States to a new and better home. On March 7th, they boarded a landing ship and sailed 128 miles east to Atoll. Their chief, King Judah, spoke as they went. "We will go," he said, "believing that everything is in the hands of God." The Bikinians had no vote. They had been asked a question by the most powerful nation on earth, and the asking was indistinguishable from a command. So they went. Atoll was too small, too poor in resources. Within 2 years, the Bikinians would be near starvation. They would ask to go home. The answer would be no. 2 years away. In the spring of 1946, the lagoon was empty, and the ships were coming. They arrived through May and into June. 70 ships, then 80, then more. The target fleet assembled at Bikini Lagoon would have constituted the 6th largest navy in the world, except that it was not a navy anymore. It was a gallery of histories dressed up as a target. The USS Nevada was painted orange, red gun barrels, white gunnels. She had been designated as the bullseye for the first test, a floating target color-coded for the bombardier at 28,000 feet. Nevada was not a ship without a past. On December 7th, 1941, she had been the only battleship at Pearl Harbor to get underway during the attack, fighting her way out of the harbor under fire. She had gone on to shell the beaches at Normandy on D-Day to support the landings at Iwo Jima. Now she wore orange paint and waited. The USS Saratoga, 700 feet long, veteran of the Pacific War from Guadalcanal to the final year, swung at anchor nearby. The USS Arkansas, commissioned in 1912, had served in 2 world wars. 34 years old, the oldest ship in the lagoon, though not the most storied. The most storied came from the enemy side. The German heavy cruiser Prince Eugen had accompanied the Bismarck on its final sortie into the Atlantic in May 1941. She survived the Hood's destruction, escaped the Royal Navy's entire search, and later sailed the length of the English Channel in broad daylight alongside Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. The Channel Dash, February 1942, passing within sight of the British coast and arriving home untouched. Now she was moored in a Pacific lagoon, waiting for what the Royal Navy could never manage to deliver. And then there was the Nagato. She displaced over 32,000 tons. Her main battery, 4 twin 16-inch guns, had once covered Imperial Navy operations from one end of the Pacific to the other. She had been laid down in 1917, launched in 1919, and had outlasted her navy, her empire, and the admiral who had commanded from her bridge. She was the only Japanese battleship to survive the entire war. She arrived at Bikini in the late spring of 1946, and the American sailors who handled her mooring lines hated her. They hated her for Pearl Harbor. Mines were already strapped to her hull. Insurance in case the bomb was not enough to finish what the war had failed to do. Onto the target ships went instrumentation, pressure gauges, radiation detectors, film dosimeters, and the animals, pigs, goats, rats, placed in the superstructures and holds as stand-ins for human crews to measure what a bomb would do to living bodies inside steel. One pig, designated 311, would survive the second test and be sent to the National Zoo in Washington. The press arrived in force. 169 journalists, photographers, and radio correspondents were credentialed for Operation Crossroads. Congressional observers, United Nations representatives, Soviet delegates. The entire event had been announced months in advance. Not like Trinity, not like Hiroshima, but openly, officially, with the world invited to watch. This was a performance as much as a test, and the Navy knew it. The bomb for the first test was loaded into the belly of a B-29 named Dave's Dream, formerly the photographic aircraft on the Nagasaki mission. The bomb was named Gilda. On its casing, someone had pinned a publicity photograph of Rita Hayworth, Hollywood's reigning symbol of glamour in 1946. Her face on the side of an atomic weapon, glamour and annihilation on the casing of a bomb about to be dropped on the flagship of the Japanese fleet. Rita Hayworth would later express distress when she learned what her image had been used for. The people who made the decision left no explanation. The fleet lay in the tropical morning. The Nevada, painted orange, at the center. The guns of the Nagato trained on a clear Pacific sky. They called it a test, but it was also a show, and the show was about to begin. At 9:34 in the morning on July 1st, 1946, Gilda fell from Dave's Dream at 28,000 feet. The bomb missed the Nevada by nearly half a mile, 980 feet short, 1,870 feet to the left. It detonated at 580 feet above the lagoon, over a cluster of ships that had not been expecting to be the center of it. From the observation vessels 10 nautical miles away, the press corps watched a distant flash, a rising cloud, and a fleet that was still largely afloat. The coverage reflected the distance. Near Dude, anticlimax. The Army Air Forces used it immediately. If this was what an atomic bomb did to an anchored fleet, perhaps the Navy had been overstating the threat all along. What the journalists could not see from 10 miles away was what had happened within half a mile of the actual detonation. The Joint Chiefs Evaluation Board reviewed the radiation data from the ships nearest the blast. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Every human being aboard every ship within that radius would have died, not from the explosion, not from the blast wave, but from the initial radiation burst. Invisible, instantaneous, absolute. The bulletin of the atomic scientists put it plainly. A large ship about a mile from the explosion would escape sinking, but its crew would be dead. Only ghost ships would remain, floating unattended in open water. The Navy chose to emphasize the ships still floating. The scientists chose to note the absent crews. The test also managed to destroy most of its own data. During the rehearsal, the signal to activate recording equipment had arrived 10 seconds late, meaning dozens of cameras, spectrographs, and shockwave instruments recorded nothing. On July 1st, in the actual drop, the same mistake happened again. The most publicly witnessed nuclear test in history left almost no usable scientific record of what it had done. The world watched. The instruments didn't. 5 ships sank. The Japanese light cruiser Sakawa, badly damaged in the blast, went under the following morning. The fireball dispersed over the lagoon. The reporters filed their copy, and the Navy began preparing to demonstrate what the first test had only suggested. In the days after Able, the surviving ships were reboarded. The initial radiation from an airburst, it turned out, was brief, intense at close range, lethal within the kill zone in the moment. But it had not made the ships themselves persistently radioactive, and so the sailors went back aboard. Damage assessment teams, repair crews, men with clipboards and wrenches, moving through battered superstructures in the tropical heat. They hosed the decks. They scrubbed with brushes and soap. The cleanup worked. Ships were repaired. Boilers inspected. Hull integrity checked, made ready for the second test. Blandy was measured. Cautious, not triumphant, but not alarmed. The Navy had not proven its case yet, but it had not disproven it either. The first test had been inconclusive in the way that suited everyone. The second bomb was being prepared. She was called Helen of Bikini. Unlike Gilda, Helen would not fall from altitude. She would be lowered carefully in a watertight steel casing into the water beneath LSM-60, a landing ship moored at the center of the fleet, 90 feet down, in water so clear you could see the casing from the surface. The first bomb had come from the sky. This one came from below. At 8:35 in the morning on July 25, 1946, the lagoon erupted. Not a fireball, not a flash from above. The water itself rose, a column half a mile wide, tearing upward for a mile and a half into the blue Pacific sky. 2 million tons of water, carrying in it the sediment of the lagoon floor, the debris of the ship directly above the detonation, and everything else within range. The column hung for a moment at its apex, and then came apart, collapsing outward and downward as a dense, rolling wall of radioactive mist that swept across the surface of the lagoon in every direction. The base surge moved at water level. It reached every ship. It coated every surface. The Arkansas stood 100 feet from the detonation point. She was gone within seconds. The Saratoga took the wave, 94 feet high, arriving 7 seconds after detonation, and began to settle. She went down in 7.5 hours. LSM-60, directly above the bomb, simply ceased to exist. No part of it has ever been identified. It is presumed to have vaporized. The Nagato was still afloat, listing slowly to starboard. The mines on her hull had not been detonated. She sat in the contaminated lagoon and she waited. The Navy moved, immediately to clean the surviving target fleet. A fireboat was dispatched to hose down the contaminated ships. The water it used came from Bikini Lagoon, the same lagoon the bomb had just detonated in, now saturated with radioactive material drawn up from the seafloor and distributed across every surface by the base surge. The fireboat sprayed the contaminated ships with contaminated water. The Joint Chiefs Evaluation Board delivered its verdict in language that left no room for interpretation. Contaminated ships, they concluded, had become radioactive stoves that would burn all living things aboard with invisible and painless but deadly radiation, not from the initial blast. From the persistent contamination, the base surge had deposited on every fitting, every steel plate, every surface of every ship in the lagoon. Then the decontamination teams filed their report. They had tried everything available: soap, brushes, fire hoses, sailors working in rotating shifts in the tropical heat to limit individual exposure. The official conclusion was stated plainly: the removal of radioactive contamination of the type encountered in the Baker target vessels could not be accomplished successfully. Could not be accomplished. Not difficult. Not requiring new methods. Could not be accomplished. The third test, codenamed Charlie, a deep-water detonation planned for 1947, was cancelled. There was nothing left to test it on. The ships were too contaminated to board, too contaminated to repair, too contaminated to use. Glenn Seaborg, who had become the longest-serving chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, called Baker the world's first nuclear disaster. The Nagato still floated, still listing, refusing. She had survived the entire Pacific War. She had survived the Able test and the initial Baker blast. Now she sat in a poisoned lagoon, 10 degrees off true, her stern slowly settling. Whether the mines strapped to her hull were ever detonated, the record does not say. What is certain is that she went alone, in the dark, before dawn on July 30th. She rolled over slowly and settled on the seabed. No one was watching. When the Americans came out to look at the lagoon that morning, she was gone. The fleet was scattered. The Nevada, painted orange, the Bullseye, the ship that had gotten underway at Pearl Harbor, survived both tests. She was decommissioned, towed to Pearl Harbor, and on July 8, 1948, attacked by aircraft and naval gunfire 40 miles southwest of where she had once survived a Japanese air raid. It took 8 hours to finally send her down. The Prinz Eugen was towed to Kwajalein after the tests. A leak developed in her hull. The repair crews could not get close enough. 5 months after the Baker shot, the contamination still made it impossible. On December 22, 1946, she capsized in a shallow lagoon. The ship that had slipped past the entire British home fleet in broad daylight sank because of a hole that no one could patch. Of the target fleet, only 9 ships were ever clean enough to be scrapped. The rest were scuttled, used as further targets, or left where the water and the years finished what the bombs had started. 85% of the 42,000 personnel who participated in Operation Crossroads received no individual radiation monitoring. The men who scrubbed contaminated decks with brushes and soap in the weeks after Baker did not know what they were absorbing. Studies later estimated that the average participant's life expectancy was shortened by roughly 3 months. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 23 nuclear detonations at Bikini Atoll. Each one added to what the first 2 had already deposited in the soil, the coral, the water, the food chain. The most consequential of those later tests, Castle Bravo in 1954, was a thermonuclear device that yielded 2.5 times what its designers had predicted and contaminated hundreds of miles of open ocean. In 1970, the United States government told the Bikinian people they could try to come home. Some did. They planted coconut trees. They began to rebuild. In 1978, they were evacuated again. The food they had grown from their own soil contained radiation at levels that could not be considered safe. In 1997, the International Atomic Energy Agency declared that the islands of Bikini Atoll should not be permanently resettled under prevailing radiological conditions. King Judah's people said they would go, believing everything was in the hands of God. 80 years later, they cannot go home. The world had watched Operation Crossroads. 169 journalists, congressional observers, representatives of the United Nations, 2 atomic bombs over 24 days. And in the end, the official report said only this, that the radioactive contamination found on the Baker target vessels could not be removed, could not be accomplished. The Navy had set out to prove its ships could survive nuclear war, and discovered in its own lagoon, with its own weapons, that they could not. The Nagato still lies at the bottom of Bikini Lagoon, upside down in 110 feet of water. Technical divers go down to her sometimes. They say she is extraordinary, vast and still. The guns that once covered Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor operation are buried in the sand below her, pointing down at nothing. The people who lived beside that lagoon are not allowed to come back. The ship that started the war for America never left.